come to victory when Lord Edward had pursued their own vulnerable left wing for miles back towards London, leaving the King and Richard of Cornwall exposed and galloping towards the city. He, Gilbert de Clare, had personally accepted the surrender of Earl Richard, having trapped him in a windmill close to where they were now gathered. Yes, those who supported change in government deserved great rewards, and none more than himself. Gilbert was a tall man and powerfully physical, all muscle. As he watched Earl Simon, he drew himself up even taller as the last 7 years fleeted through his vision. He thought of the realignment of loyalties, including his own, because King Henry had broken promise after promise. The barons and clergy had demanded simple changes in government. Henry had accepted the Barons' Council of 15 after years of negotiations to help the king rule fairly the shires that made up England. A Privy Council was designed to advise Henry, curb his building and pageantry extravagances, his outrageous expenditure on feuding in Gascony, England's remaining territory across the narrow sea, and to put right his appallingly poor administration. They would advise the king on the custody of royal castles and oversee ministerial appointments. After promising to accept these provisions, Henry had reneged, seeking the Pope's approval for his actions. He broke the agreement, claiming his hand had been forced. That had been the final straw for Gilbert, who had recently come into his earldom on his father's death. Gilbert's brow darkened as he felt a frown grow across his forehead, and he considered how Henry's Lusignan stepbrothers, as well as the Queen's Savoyard relatives, between them had controlled England and the king. These foreigners were England's greatest archbishops, bishops, and even earls through marriages forged with their land's greatest heiresses and heirs. In fact, Gilbert mused, with his lips curling with distaste, at only 10 years of age, he had been pushed into marriage with one of them, 8 years his senior. He grimaced as a picture of cold, unpleasant, proudly beautiful Alex, his wife, clouded his vision. He had heard rumours of her behaviour with Lord Edward when the king had taken his half-niece prisoner along with the garrison of Tunbridge Castle. There had been hope of change when Earl Simon returned to England from exile in France 2 years previously and consolidated opposition to the king. After routs throughout the south, Simon had even attempted to settle the differences between king and barons in a fair manner, or so he had thought. When Simon asked the King of France to arbitrate and persuade Henry to accept the statutes proposed by his barons, pious Louis, like the Pope before him, sided with Henry. After all, the French king was autocratic, and he was married to that proud Provençal woman, Queen Eleanor's sister Marguerite. King Louis would never gainsay his own brother-in-law. How could they accept such a judgment? The war had begun in earnest after that. He thought of how Queen Eleanor was in France raising troops to support the royalist cause. It was as well they had victory at Lewes. The victory was a stroke of good fortune after loyalist successes. Gilbert did not believe in God's will particularly, favouring instead Lady Fortune. At first it seemed as if Lord Edward and King Henry would trounce them, since Edward had made such a brilliant cavalry charge. But he later destroyed his luck by chasing his quarry from the field, meaning Henry was left to launch an infantry attack up Offham Hill. Now Henry was their prisoner and must negotiate, and the Queen would shudder with fear when the news reached her Gascon stronghold. Gilbert whispered his thanks to Lady Luck and shook his mane of startling red hair. What next? He would help Montfort rule, Lord Simon's right-hand man. His eyes widened at the thought of power, gold in his coffers and new castles. Not that he did not have plenty already. After all, his sire had been England's wealthiest baron. Still, you can never have too much.